Welcome to the world of William Wynn and flying behind the proven and reliable Corvair engine. The satisfaction and pride of building your very own Corvair engine for flight is unequaled and will bring you, the builder, years of enjoyment and performance. William Wynn has dedicated his life to the development of the most safe and reliable flight conversion of the Corvair engine. Every concept, theory, or idea has been thoroughly tested on the ground and, most importantly, in many hours of flight. This proven combination of modifications and procedures is being presented to provide a better understanding of the process and techniques involved in building the best flight conversion of the Corvair engine. This is in line with William Wynn's ongoing education process through seminars and speaking engagements around the country. William Wynn wants you to be successful and join the many others who are building or flying behind the Corvair engine. Like everyone else, you must start at the beginning with disassembly of the core engine.
Welcome to the quick and dirty engine disassembly video. Here's a Corvair engine as removed from a car. From this rusty, messy pile, a good aircraft engine can be found inside and made to power your home-built aircraft. In this video, we're going to go step by step on the disassembly procedure. Many people see this and have a hard time seeing how the aircraft engine comes out of it. We'll go through each procedure on the disassembly phase, which will get you started on your aircraft engine conversion. When the engine's removed from the car or found stored in this condition, there are a number of accessories that we will not be using. The engine looks wide and bulky, and in this form it is, but when it's stripped down, you'll see that it produces an excellent aircraft engine conversion. The engine here is an RH motor. The letter codes for which are the most desirable engines to use in an aircraft engine conversion are in the conversion manual. When the engine was removed from the car in this condition, it's highly likely it was never worked on, and that's a desirable feature. You're looking for an engine that's complete in this way. This engine has 2 carburetors on it. Although it has 2 carburetors that we're not going to use, the general look of the engine in this condition tells you that the engine was never taken apart or never worked on. We would like original engines to work on if at all possible. This engine was a 110 horsepower engine in the car, and like its 95 horsepower brethren also covered in the conversion manual, either engine will produce a 100 horsepower aircraft engine conversion. Many people ask, where are the ID marks on the Corvair? And looking upon the complete engine, this is the oil filler tube right here. At the base of the oil filler tube, down about 3 inches below my finger, underneath the goo, is where the engine code is. This particular motor has the last 2 digits RH. You're concerned when identifying the motor with the last 2 digits in the serial number. The engine, when it's cleaned up like this, just in its first preliminary cleaning, the bare case shows you off the end of my thumb that this engine case code is an RG. The conversion manual additionally contains the correct cylinder head numbers. The cylinder head numbers on an assembled engine like this are much more difficult to see. They're buried under the sheet metal where my fingertip is pointing. If you remove the sheet metal from the engine, you'll be able to see the cylinder head identification number. The identification number is on the end of the cylinder head. In the same position, that cylinder head sitting on the motor here. The ID number is where my finger is pointing, which is located underneath the sheet metal at this location on the engine. When looking at an engine that's in its undisturbed condition, if you look at it and it has an RH or other acceptable letter code, when the engine has never been molested, it's easy to look at it and suspect that it has the correct cylinder heads on it. When looking at a motor like this, the only 2 things that you need to make a purchase are the conversion manual to ID the numbers and a 3/4 inch wrench. The 3/4 inch wrench is applied to the nut on the end of the harmonic balancer. If you can turn the motor 360 degrees, the motor is not seized or mechanically damaged inside. It makes an ideal core. Engines that are seized or exposed to weather should be bypassed in favor of better cores. Even if you have to spend more money, considerably more money, the engine that is stored as a complete unit indoors that can rotate 360 degrees is a much more favorable start to a conversion process. Looking above the valve cover, you can see the upper row of cylinder head studs. This particular motor, they're covered in a lot of dirt and grime. Of importance, if you are given a choice, select the motor that may have dirt and grime, but you're looking for the end of the 6 studs to be not corroded. There should be clean thread after you scrub it off with a wire brush. There should be clean thread shown above the 6 nuts above the valve cover. You may have to dig through the muck to get a look at it. If the threads are destroyed above the nuts, engine disassembly will be more difficult and the studs will have to be replaced eventually in your conversion process. Again, perhaps looking a little further or spending a little more time in selection of a motor will save you a lot of time later on. This is the differential end of the motor. This particular motor, an RH, came with an automatic transmission. Whatever transmission your engine came with, or differential, you need the bell housing to produce the front cover. This will be the prop side of the engine. This bell housing right here is from an automatic Corvair. Notice it has air cooling slots. Given a choice, this is easier to work with because there's less material to be removed. Round 2, manual transmission bell housing. This bell housing has no air-cooled slots in it. It is slightly, and I repeat, only slightly more difficult to work with. This or the other one, you need one to go with your conversion. They are plentiful in the land of Corvairs. Every Corvair motor came with one. If you have a good deal on a motor and it doesn't include a bell housing, don't worry. You can get one from a separate source later on. This piece will be right behind your prop hub. The finished part looks like this. Again, this is part of the conversion process and outlined in the manual, but this cover has been trimmed out of one of the bell housings. There are a number of components you're going to discard and a number that you're going to keep during the conversion process. Let me suggest throwing nothing away initially. There are many pieces that we won't use. The magnesium blower fan, the alternator, the carburetors, but they don't take up much space. So keep them around. If you take a look at many of the other components that people accidentally discard, cylinder baffles from the end of the motor, and we'll show you those specifically later, those are necessary for an aircraft conversion. Many of the things we'll throw away, but again, let's keep them around just to get started. We'll go over it piece by piece later on. As you become more familiar with the engine, by disassembling it, working with it, and reading through the conversion manual, you'll understand all the pieces. But for starters, don't throw away things. This is a harmonic balancer that's been rebuilt from a core. And this motor, the 110, the harmonic balancer is located off the end of my finger. Even though this one kind of looks dirty, it can be turned into a remanufactured one such as this. Almost all 110 motors came with harmonic balancers. Most 95s did not have a harmonic balancer. If you have one, keep it. If you have a motor that's in good condition that you're looking at purchasing and it does not have a harmonic balancer, don't worry. You can buy one later on and pay a simple core charge. Here's one of our remanufactured dual ignition distributors. Like every other one that we built, it started off life as a regular Corvair distributor, many of them in this condition right here. If you're looking at a motor and it has a distributor, count on taking it with you, no matter what its condition, and mailing it to us for its conversion to the dual ignition system that's flying on almost all Corvair engines. If you get a motor and it doesn't have a distributor, but otherwise it's in excellent condition, don't consider bypassing it. If you've got a good motor lacking 1 or 2 core pieces, you can always get them from us. From here, we're going to remove the major sheet metal off the engine and carefully remove the carburetors and the accessories off the engine and begin to strip down the basic components of the engine. Before actually disassembling anything on the motor, drain the oil out. Many Corvair engines this age will have black cottage cheese for oil. But first, take it all out, you'll spare yourself a big mess. To drain the oil, we simply take the drain plug out using a 7/8 inch wrench. Let's get the stunt mechanic in here. Hey, Billy. Here we see the motor stripped down a little bit more with most of the sheet metal removed and a lot of the accessory parts gone. As you can see, the engine not only served as a car motor for a number of years, but also as living quarters to various bugs and animals. Carburetors may be of some value to Corvair car people if they're in fairly reasonable condition. But again, this doesn't take up much space. You might leave these around. Top shroud. The top shroud, unless you're building an exact replica of a Bernie Pietenpol engine, is of no value to you as an aircraft person. Top shrouds for 110 and 95 motors are extremely common and do not have value to car people whatsoever. If you're building an electric start motor, you won't need this. This is the sheet metal where the carburetor was mounted on the side of the engine. Again, 110 sheet metal, 95 sheet metal, very common, not of any real value to car collectors. The piece from the other side, same thing. Damper door assembly. Alternator. The alternator itself may have some trade-in value at Clark's Corvairs if the alternator is complete. But this one, not really complete. This is not used on any Corvair aircraft conversion except for an exact replica of Bernie Pietenpol's conversion. Again, this is a heavy component and not used in a modern Corvair conversion as per my manual. Here is a piece that we use. These pieces of sheet metal and these are used on the rear of the motor. This one is on the oil cooler side between the cylinders and the oil cooler. This piece goes between the cylinders and the distributor. Although this one's got a little bit of corrosion, it could be trimmed to work in an aircraft. These two lightweight sheet metal stampings are part of the cooling system of your aircraft conversion. You're going to want to keep these. This is the oil cooler that came stock on this 110 motor. This is referred to as an 8-plate oil cooler. You can count up the number of plates and you'll obviously see that it has 8 plates. While these have flown on engines before, it's considered deficient cooling. You want to get the best oil cooler you can. So, when I see an 8-plate cooler, straight into the junk heap. Here's a 12-plate cooler. 12-plate coolers generally came on 140 horsepower engines and 180 turbos. They're commonly available. If you don't have one with your core, there are plenty of sources to get one at a reasonable price, and you can clean it up and use it. Most of the hours that we've flown over the years are on 12-plate coolers. This is a very dirty folded fin cooler. Notice that it has a radiator-like appearance. It is a very efficient cooler, and it works slightly better than a 12-plate does. This is an acceptable cooler provided that you can clean it properly and get it to a point where it has no contaminants inside. But these are the 12 plate and the folded fin are the only two coolers you should keep. 3 plates and 8 plates straight into the trash. In my hand is a cast iron exhaust log removed from another motor. It came off this position right here on the motor. As we go over here, you can still see the original one installed on this side. The cast iron exhaust logs weigh about 4 pounds apiece. Despite their appearance, they actually work fairly well. There are a number of flight hours have been accumulated on them, mostly in piston poles, but a lot of KR2s operate with them. On a 601 engine installation, the shape of the motor mount precludes their use. But a lot of people keep them around. So you want to take them off carefully by tapping them with a hammer and undoing all the fasteners and very carefully removing them. In a 601 engine installation, the location of the exhaust interferes with the motor mount. You'll end up with one of our stainless exhaust pieces that looks like this, that's far lighter and more efficient. Here's the oil pan from the stock vehicle. It's a flat, stamped steel pan. They're frequently damaged in the car because they're the skid plate on the car and also the amateur jack point. This one's in acceptable condition. A number of people have flown them over the years. They certainly work, and the conversion manual outlines that. They need to be modified in the area of the mounting point of the engine. However, many pans are not in good condition, or their owners desire something different, or a higher capacity or a deeper sump pan. There's a deep sump, lightweight oil pan that we manufacture in the same position as it would be installed in the engine. We're now going to dig into the rest of the disassembly and go through the removal of various pieces on the motor. Always use an actual puller to pull the balancer off to avoid damaging it. Although we've used them and flown them before in the past, we no longer recommend using the Corvair mechanical fuel pump. It has no core value, so you can remove it by removing the pinch bolt and take the entire assembly and toss it. Here's the idler pulley. Again, in every conversion except for a Bernie Piston Pole replica, you're going to take this piece off and just toss it. In General Motors terminology, this piece I hold in my hands is referred to as a Delcotron adapter. This basically is the stock alternator and oil filter mount with the oil filler neck included. It's this piece right here on the motor. We're going to take it off by removing the 5 bolts with a 1/2-inch socket that are retaining the piece on the engine. It must be removed so that the mechanical fuel pump actuator rod can be removed. This piece off the end of my finger is the mechanical fuel pump actuator rod. On many motors, it's varnished in place from years of not moving. This has to be removed before the rear cover can be pulled off. There it is. You can go ahead and discard it. After after removing the 7 bolts with a 1/2 inch socket, you can carefully tap and remove the rear oil accessory cover. What most people do these days are send these in to us and they go back out as a completely built and tested unit with a new oil pump in it and the remote oil filter housing. This stamped sheet metal item is the oil slinger ring. It's got a small keyway in it and can be removed once it's lined up. That piece should be removed and cleaned. It keeps oil from being thrown directly on the rear seal. It must be reinstalled before the rear cover is put back on the rebuilt motor. So take this off, but remember to put it back on before you assemble the motor. This is the Corvair's late model magnesium blower fan. It's on its own fan bearing and it's driven by the V-belt. Again, only the Bernie Pete and Paul replica conversions will utilize this setup. Pete and Paul's built to use modern electric start engines like our conversion obviously will not have the fan anymore. What we're going to do next is remove this entire fan, the bearing support, and the cover. The easiest way to do this is by removing all of these bolts around the perimeter with a 1/2 inch wrench. After removing the top cover, you can clearly see the crankshaft and the connecting rods in the engine. The top cover and blower fan assembly are garbage. You can toss them away. The blower fan itself, if you disassemble the unit, you'll notice is made out of extremely thin, lightweight magnesium. For an experiment, or a little bit of fun, you can light it on fire with a propane torch. But do it outside, please. Next, we're going to remove a cylinder head. To remove the cylinder head, first you must take the valve cover off. The valve cover is held down by 4 bolts that you can take off with a 7/16 wrench or socket. They're holding the spring clips down. You want to keep the spring clips and you want to keep the valve covers even if they look kind of grungy. We're going to go ahead and remove those and it will expose the rocker arms and the valve train. After removing the valve covers, you can see the 6 rocker arms on this side of the motor. The rocker arms need to be removed in order to remove the cylinder head. The stock nut on the end of the rocker shaft has to be removed. A 5/8 inch socket slid down on there will allow you to unscrew the rocker arm. Particularly dirty motors will require a little pulling with your hand. Now, you want to save the rocker arm, you want to throw away the nut, and you want to throw away the ball. The only pieces we're going to save here are the rocker arm itself, the push rod, and later on we're going to pull the studs and the guide plates and save those also. But go ahead and pull all the rocker arms off and pull out all the push rods. Keep in mind again, throw away the nuts and the balls. Each Corvair cylinder head has 2 rows of studs holding it on. The upper row of studs coming down here has a set of nuts that are removed with a 9/16 socket. The lower row of studs utilizes the rocker arm stud, right there, is the actual nut on top. A deep set 13/16 socket will remove this. Acting as a washer is the guide plate. On each cylinder head, you have 3 guide plates and 6 rocker arm studs in that position. 13/16 socket, deep set, unscrews them. Remember, you want to save the guide plates and the rocker studs. They'll both be going back into your motor if they're in good condition. This is a push rod tube. The motor obviously has 12 of them, one for each intake and one for each exhaust. These are on the bottom of the engine. This setup is exactly like a continental aircraft engine. What we want to do is remove these push rod tubes from the engine without mangling them. The easiest way to do this is not to grab them with vice grips. A number of simple tools, like a half-round piece of tubing, 7/8 of an inch, can sit in here and be utilized to tap the tube loose. The original natural rubber O-rings are going to be hard as a rock and varnished in place. Those will be providing the drag to keep you from pulling this out with bare hand pressure. So just some type of removal tool, like this piece of half-round tubing, is utilized to tap the tube underneath the O-ring boss. A number of Corvair shops, mostly Clark's Corvairs, has this part available if you don't want to fabricate it yourself. Let's go ahead and remove all the push rod tubes on this side. They don't need to be pulled all the way out of the head. They just need to be made loose and gotten out of the way. The push rod tubes, like I say, have a hardened O-ring down in the groove. This needs to be carefully removed before the push rod is dragged through the cylinder head. With the O-ring removed, the push rod tube can easily be removed through the cylinder head. Right here is the top row of head studs running vertically down here. There's 6 of them in there, and they'll take a 9/16 socket to remove them. This is one of the larger challenges of disassembling a motor. If you can find a really clean motor, you won't have any hassle just simply unscrewing these. However, if the tops of the studs are mangled and corroded from years of exposure to salted roads or some other type of mechanical damage, they'll provide some degree of difficulty coming apart. You want to immediately start with using a 6-point socket, not a 12-point socket. You want to get Croyle, PB Blaster, or liquid wrench and soak the top of the threads for several days in advance of taking them apart. Use a wire brush and remove all the goo and muck off of the parts before attempting to disassemble them. What you're trying to avoid doing is overstressing the stud if the stud is in good shape. The nut is to be considered expendable. In many cases, if you have a reluctant nut that will refuse to come off, I'll split it with a chisel and unscrew it. Down in the groove on the center 4, this is something of a challenge, but can be done carefully. But careful soaking with penetrating oil and a 6-point socket will generally remove the nut without too much difficulty. Keep in mind, if the stud is in good shape and you want to remove the nut and you use a large impact gun, you will damage the stud by exposing it to excessive torque in reverse. The stud is never to see more than 30 or 40 foot-pounds of torque. If you put an impact wrench on it and pretend that it's a lug nut on a truck and hit it in reverse, you may very well eventually get the nut out, but far more likely you will either rip the threads out of the case or damage the stud in reverse by twisting it until it yields. So take your time and do good work and operate conservatively here. Time to remove the oil pan. This is the oil pump pickup. This pickup needs to have that bolt removed with a 1/2-inch wrench. If you're using the stock pan again, you're going to clean the tube and use it again. If you're using one of our deep sump pans, you're going to turn this part in as a core on a newly built oil pan installation kit. After the top row of nuts has been removed, the cylinder head is ready to come off. After 30 or more years of the cylinder head being in one place, it will likely be reluctant to come off. You need to use a plastic dead blow hammer or a wooden block. When you tap on the cylinder head to take it off, be careful. You don't want to beat on any cylinder fins. You don't want to beat on any weak areas, like a corner. You just want to lightly work it back and forth. If you look down between the head and the fins, you'll notice the cylinder head coming off ever so slightly. When this happens, make sure it comes off square and isn't cocked. There's the cylinder head free from the motor. If this cylinder head had required being tapped off, I would have hit it in close. Nowhere near any of the fins. Don't ever pry anything in between there. You just want to catch in close down by one of the corners with a wooden block. We see a lot of heads that have that corner broken off. You want to avoid that. The carburetor boss is a fairly strong area. Don't beat in any of the thin little corners. Don't beat on cylinder fins. But the carburetor boss and down in close to the head will work. These are the lower sheet metal baffles below the engine. All flight engines require these. Years ago, at the Pete and Pole convention, I saw an engine there that had no lower baffles. The gentleman had brought the engine in from far away in a pickup truck to show people, and he claimed that Corvairs didn't have good cooling. In a second, I spotted that he did not have any baffles in place. He had a beautiful, wonderful-looking engine that was missing this one piece. You must have your engine 100% airworthy, not 99% perfect and 1% completely deficient. This is an integral part of your cooling system as much as the rubber baffling or the hole in the front of the cowling. So these are held in place by two little spring clips. You'll want to keep the spring clips. If yours are shot, you can get more from Clark's, but you want to keep this piece of sheet metal, one from each side. They'll be going back on the engine when you rebuild it. Here's the bottom of the stock General Motors dipstick tube. This tube hangs all the way to the bottom of the flat pan. It is shielding the dipstick itself so that you can measure the amount of oil when an idling engine in the car. This is not a good setup for an aircraft. In an aircraft, if you were to ice over the breather or clog the breather in some way, the engine will need to exhale its blow-by gas. If you have the dipstick tube submerged in oil, the first place the oil is going to come out of the motor is straight out the dipstick, and it's not going to be blowing out bypass gas, it's going to be blowing pure oil out, just like a soda straw in the bottom of a glass. So we're going to remove this. When we replace this, with another dipstick tube, we're going to make sure that it only protrudes through the case. You'll never be checking the oil in a running aircraft engine, so it's not an issue. The deep sump pan moves the level of oil down in the motor, so this isn't as critical an issue. But certainly, if you're using a flat stock pan in an engine, you cannot leave this pushrod tube in place. Excuse me, you cannot leave this dipstick tube in place. Besides, during the rebuilding process, the dipstick tube will be in the way. How we generally remove them is by taking a 5/16 bolt and tapping it out. You can just put the bolt in place, tap it with a hammer, and drive the pushrod tube, drive the dipstick tube out of the engine case. The next step in the disassembly process is to remove the rod bolt nuts and remove the connecting rods out of the engine. When you move the connecting rods out of a Corvair, you'll be taking the piston and cylinder with the rod as an assembly. This is why it's important to get an engine that rotates 360 degrees. If you had an engine that was jammed and refused to rotate, it will be very difficult to get through this stage of the disassembly. When the engine rotates and is free to turn, you can put the bolt back in the end of the crankshaft and rotate the crank to any favorable position to reach any of the rod nuts. It's much easier for a first-time builder to take apart a free motor. In the shop, we take apart stuck motors all the time, and it takes a certain amount of perseverance and skill to do it without wrecking the motor. In some cases, with motors that have been severely corroded or stuck, all we get out of them is perhaps the crankshaft and one or two connecting rods. The two tools that we use to take the rod nuts off are a small, heavy-duty 1/4-inch breaker bar or ratchet and a 7/16 socket. You'll find out that they're torqued to about 25 to 30 foot-pounds, and they're not easy to come out. A piece of 5/8-inch thick wall tubing that fits down over the ratchet will give you additional leverage to unscrew them. Imitation tools from China or other former communist countries need not apply here. That's the Corvair's standard rod nut. You're not going to keep the rod nuts or the rod bolts. You're going to send them in with your connecting rods as cores. All the flight motors that we build and all the ones that you should build at home need ARP rod bolts and nuts utilized during the rod rebuilding process. I recommend having Clark's Corvairs or Jeff Ballard do the connecting rods. But at this point, you can unscrew these and carefully, using a small hammer and an aluminum punch or a brass drift, lightly tap on the end of the rod bolt to separate the cap from the rod itself. By turning the engine to a favorable position, you can loosen each rod nut, unscrew it, and then tap it apart and reach inside and pull the cap off. It can be time-consuming. Be patient. Don't hit anything with a screwdriver. Don't pry anything apart. Just take your time and work the rod cap off evenly. If it jams and is reluctant to come apart, tap it back on and try and pull it off evenly. With a little bit of practice, here in the shop, we regularly take off all 6 rods and rod caps in about 10 minutes. At home, if it takes you an hour your first time, you're doing pretty good. Just be patient and work through it slowly. Using the wrench, I'm going to turn this rod to the most favorable position to remove the lower rod nut. Here's where a high quality 1/4 inch fine tooth ratchet and a 12.7/16 socket come into play. And it's loose. We're going to lightly tap on the end of the rod bolt to loosen the rod cap. If you'll come in really close, you'll notice that the two have separated right there. By lightly tapping the two back together, I bring the gap even. When the gap is close to being even, you can wiggle the rod cap and it will gradually come off. That's the rod cap removed right there. There's the rod bearing removed out of the cap. We're going to turn the crank to a favorable position and simply slide the piston and cylinder assembly out together. When you repeat this process by rotating the crankshaft and taking off in turn the 5 other piston, cylinder, and rod assemblies, you'll have the engine assembled, disassembled down to the bare case. If your engine was loose and turned over easily, you should be able to slide the piston and rod assembly straight out of the bore. You want to be very careful not to break any fins on the cylinders. When you send the cylinders into Clark's to have them bored, it's important that they don't have any broken fins on them whatsoever. We don't expect to get those back. We would only build a flight motor with perfect fins. Just be careful, they're somewhat fragile. Here's a piston, approximately 40 years old. Perhaps it had 20 years in service. Like all General Motors pistons, it's a cast piston. We'll be returning this motor to flight status with forged pistons only. But it will use rebuilt Corvair connecting rods. These connecting rods, along with the cap, can be sent back in as cores for a first-class set of rebuilt rods with ARP nuts on them. If you would like, you can knock the pistons off the rods and save on the shipping. The pistons, the rings, and the wrist pins are all garbage. Inside the bell housing are 9 bolts that take a 9/16 socket to remove. Some people miss the ones down in the lower corners. Again, you got to take all 9 out. remember to remove and save the oil cooler housing. One of the final steps is to remove the 8 case bolts. The case bolts are 5/8 on one side, 11/16 on the other. They're torqued to about 50 pounds from the factory. With all the case bolts removed, the case can be gently tapped apart. Never ever pry on any of the surfaces of the crankcase. If it's reluctant to come out, look for the one bolt that you left in. There's the Corvair's crank. Flipping it over, we can see the 8409. This crankshaft is in pretty good shape. It may very well clean up with just a polish. This shows you the inherent strength and good lubrication system of Corvair engines. If you take out a calculator and think about it, this crankshaft did more than 100,000 miles. If you average it at 30 miles an hour and figure about 2,000 RPM, that's 400 million revolutions it did without significant wear on it. One of the first tests we perform with any crankshaft we take out of a motor is a ring test. Usually you have to remove the bolt and perhaps the distributor drive gear off the end. But if this is wedged firmly in place, a ring test is possible. That crank will ring for 20 seconds if it has no cracks or deformities in it. This is a good sound crank. This would pass any basic MagnaFlux test. This is the stock cam. Cams rarely wear significantly in Corvair motors. The only thing that usually causes wear on the cam is if dirty oil was run through the engine relentlessly and the lifter stops spinning on the cam. If you're using a reground OT10 cam from Clark's, you'll need to send this in as a core. If you're using a new cam, you will not need to send this in. We never use the same cam gear twice. New cam gear is less than $40. The only other thing to remove from the engine are the original lifters. By just carefully taking them out, the original lifters will come out of the engine. You're going to replace all these with your new camshaft, so we're not saving these. These are straight into the trash. That covers disassembly of the Corvair motor. The next stage will become cleaning and inspection of the parts. I hope this video is helpful in showing you how to get started with your motor. The first day that you dig into the core engine and go to work on it is a day closer to realizing your dream of building and flying your own airplane with the Corvair motor that you built inside it. Hey, thanks for watching. If you like what you're seeing, please remember to subscribe.